Hi, I'm Elaine Engelhardt from Utah Valley State. Welcome to class today. The class is Ethics and Values, and we're moving into a new segment on existentialism. And one of our best specialists at Utah Valley State is Dr. Pierre LaMarche. Thanks for being here with us, Pierre.
Thank you, Elaine.
Appreciate it. And the students who are joining us today are John and Rhonda. And over here we have Kisper and Aaron. So thank you to all of you. You're really quite a Nietzschean scholar, aren't you? Tell us a little bit about your interest in Nietzsche and your study.
Well, I have an interest in a lot of areas of 19th and 20th century European philosophy, and anybody who is interested in 19th and certainly 20th century European philosophy, Nietzsche is just an absolutely central, crucial figure. So he's extraordinarily important to many of the different strands of philosophical theory that developed in the 20th century. And that's basically my interest in Nietzsche, is his association with figures and traditions that I do research in.
And you know, you'll find some authors, whether in philosophy or literature, who say, this is my work pre-Nietzsche, my work post-Nietzsche, that it made such a big difference. Why would it make such a big difference?
Well, he's certainly one of the most challenging figures in the history of Western theory in general, and an extraordinarily, even by today's standards, Nietzsche is of course writing in the late 1800s, but even by today's standards, an extremely insightful and original thinker. And it's difficult to come across the work of somebody like this and not be affected positively or negatively in a significant way.
Thank you. He does shift paradigms, doesn't he?
Absolutely.
He moves us from a very comfortable position into considering some new notions. And, you know, at least for my students, quite often, some notions they haven't considered before. And
I find the students generally appreciate Nietzsche a great deal, even if they end up disagreeing with him, precisely because they find him to be somebody who really challenges them to think in different sorts of ways and from different sorts of perspectives.
Sure, and that's all we ask, is that they just understand. They don't have to agree.
Absolutely.
Yes. Well, John, do you think you could tell us a little bit about Nietzsche's background?
Yeah, he was born in Germany in 1844. He was born into a very Christian family in the Lutheran tradition. His father and his grandfather were both Lutheran ministers, and he and his family kind of carried that tradition on even after his father died when he was very young, when he was 5. And that kind of influenced a lot of his thought, because later he's going to be a strong critic of Christianity. When he was in school, he studied philology, which is kind of a branch of philosophy that focuses specifically on ancient Greek thought. And so he read a lot of Plato, and that would influence his work later. He had a very productive life, even though he died in 1900. He was fairly young, and he spent the last 11 years of his life in insanity. He had basically had a mental breakdown as a result of syphilis. Or we think it was syphilis, pretty sure.
Yeah, most likely. Comments you'd like to add, or additions to his life then?
Yeah, well, he was an extraordinarily precocious student and was basically handed a chair in classical philology at the University of Basel at the age of 24.
Really?
Without having completed a dissertation or finished his PhD, he was handed this position because of the brilliance of his thought. And suffered a complete breakdown, as John mentioned, in 1889. Spent the last 10 years of his life basically in a catatonic state. Not entirely sure exactly what the cause is. Speculation is that it might have been syphilis, but he was unhealthy and sick his entire life. So unwell, unhealthy, sick, suffering, that in 1879 he had to resign his chair at the University of Basel. Basically take extended sick leave, and he spent the last 10 productive, sane years of his life traveling around Southern Europe, and this is the time period during which he was most productive, and most of his most significant works were composed after he was forced to retire because of his illness at a very early age.
What are your favorite works by Nietzsche?
My favorite works are some of the later ones. On the Genealogy of Morals is one of my favorites, and a short but very, very sweet little volume called Twilight of the Idols is possibly my favorite Nietzschean text.
Great. All right, any of you students want to add anything? Tell us your favorite Nietzschean text or concept.
I think it's interesting to note that he, for a time, had a close-knit friendship with Wagner, Richard Wagner, and his wife, and then later had a falling out with them, and that I just find that an interesting tidbit.
Yeah, he had a very stormy relationship with Wagner, to whom he was attracted because Nietzsche himself was a bit of a musician, composed music, and played the piano, I believe, and was very much attracted by the notion of one of the paradigms for living a grand life would be to do so artistically and aesthetically and through music and art, etc., etc. So Wagner at the time was the greatest composer in Europe, probably, and he was very attracted to. He's apparently quite a magnetic, dynamic personality as well.
Yes.
But yeah, they had a number of fallings out during the course of their friendship, and ultimately Nietzsche and Wagner parted ways, largely because of Wagner's nationalism, virulent German nationalism, which Nietzsche found to be kind of silly, and also because of his anti-Semitism. Wagner's virulent anti-Semitism, which sort of back then went hand in hand with the nationalism.
Which is interesting, since the Nazis at one point tried to kind of take up Nietzsche as one of their philosophies or an influence or whatever, but isn't it his sister who, there's some strange way that
his
comes
sister
out.
actually married a virulent German nationalist and anti-Semite, and it was his sister, Elizabeth Förster, who ended up taking care of Nietzsche in the last 10 years of his life and was responsible for collecting together his unpublished notebooks. And it was by means of that association that Nietzsche came to become of interest to people in the German nationalist movement, which later, in the first few decades of the 20th century, led to Nazism, yeah.
But certainly, as Pierre and I were visiting about before class, his position would be just about the opposite of the German nationalist position. And so he would not want people unthinkingly doing things robotically as a slave.
Certainly National Socialism would have represented herd slave mentality at its sort of highest.
Wouldn't have fit him at all.
No.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and start with our graphics then for today. And Rhonda, would you read the first one, please?
Whether it be hedonism, pessimism, utilitarianism, or eudaimonism, all those modes of thinking which measure the worth of things according to pleasure and pain, that is, according to accompanying circumstances and secondary considerations, are plausible modes of thought and naivete, which everyone conscious of creative powers and an artist's conscience will look down upon with scorn, though not without sympathy.
Okay, what's he getting at here, John? What's the point of this?
Well, as we're going to find out later, Nietzsche isn't much of a fan of utilitarianism, and he thinks that it ignores suffering as a fundamental part of who we are, and that certain philosophies are trying to ignore that aspect of life and suffering. And Nietzsche's going to say, no, wait a minute, we're going to bring suffering back into it and recognize it as a vital part of existence.
All right, thank you. Anyone want to add to this? Aaron?
Well, I think there's more than just utilitarianism that he's going to say he hates, but the hedonism and the pessimism as well. He's going to say that the hedonist who is seeking always for pleasure is lacking something, but the pessimist who says everything is pain ignores the concept of creation, and Nietzsche wants us to really be creative and artistic and involved in these really important, what he sees as really important activities.
Okay, thank you. Pierre, what would you like to add to that?
That's a crucial point that Aaron was
so.
making. I think one of the main ideas that he's trying to get at here in this quote is this notion that if you're going to live a great, exciting, dynamic, fulfilling life, creative life, then you're going to be out there and you're going to be doing things that involve risks, and sometimes you're going to fall down and you're going to hurt yourself and you're going to experience pain and suffering. But this is part of living an exciting, dynamic, creative, fulfilling, rich life. And this is really, I think, what he's striving for as some kind of an ideal.
Truly, and you're living your own life, not a life that someone else is prescribing for you every step of the way.
Right, not one that is supposed to keep you safe and sound.
Okay, and let's go ahead and read the next graphic, and could you do this for us, Rhonda?
Sympathy for ignorant moralists. Our sympathy is a loftier and further-sighted sympathy. We see how man dwarfs himself, how you dwarf him.
Okay, so where are we moving with this now then, John?
Well, Nietzsche views kind of the sympathy that we might have for someone who falls down, for someone who is suffering, as kind of a weakness that as long as we have sympathy for them, we're going to try to overcome that, and we're going to ignore it, and we're going to ignore its importance.
Okay, thank you. And anything you'd like to add to that, Rhonda or Kisper? So why is he going to talk about dwarf here? Why is he going to use that as the verb on this one, Pierre?
Well, sympathy is sort of a loaded term for him. It sort of stands as one of the central values and the central ideas of Western morality, Judeo-Christian morality, that, again, as John pointed out, he is ultimately going to argue very strongly against. And on his view, this value system has made human beings weaker and lesser than they might have been. This value system has caused human beings to become smaller than they really could be. This value system has dwarfed humanity, dwarfed human beings.
Okay.
And so I think that's also one of the major points that he's getting at here with this notion.
And so many parts of the value system. It's not, as Aaron mentioned, it's not just the utilitarians. We have everyone from our virtue ethicists to the deontologists. It doesn't matter. He does use some of Kant's work, but it doesn't matter. He's going to say they're all leading you astray. The religions are all leading you astray. They're keeping you from this fullness of life.
They're keeping you from being active and dynamic. And once again, to get back to the specific example of the value from this particular quote, sympathy on his view is a worthless attitude or emotion. If you see somebody fall down, help them up.
Yeah, so what? Okay. Well, let's go ahead and pull on to our next one, where he's going to talk about suffering is necessary. And John, we're still talking about some of the points that you've made. Do you want to read this for us, please?
Yeah. Suffering is necessary. The discipline of suffering, or of great suffering, know ye not that it is only this discipline that has produced all the elevations of humanity hitherto.
And could you continue on? I'm going to have you do 2 more graphs.
Okay. Greatness comes through suffering. The tension of soul in misfortune, which communicates to it its energy, its shuddering in view of rack and ruin, its inventiveness and bravery in undergoing, enduring, interpreting, and exploiting misfortune, and whatever depth, mystery, disguise, spirit, artifice, or greatness has been bestowed upon the soul, has it not been bestowed through suffering, through the discipline of great suffering? Meant to suffer, a man must necessarily suffer and is meant to suffer.
Okay, so Aaron, tell us a little bit about all this suffering. Is it that necessary? Certainly for Nietzsche it is.
I was going to say, I don't think he's mincing any words here. He says that suffering is actually the critical thing. That any advances we make are possible through suffering, that suffering is the key element, that it's the necessity of wanting something different or something more or to overcome that leads us to the creative principle.
All right, good response. And Pierre, do you think that it had anything to do with his life?
I think when he emphasizes this notion in passages such as the one that we just had a look at, sort of hyperbolically, I think in part it's a reflection of his own life. And again, as I mentioned earlier, very unhealthy, very sick person throughout his entire life, experienced a very significant amount of physical and psychological suffering during the course of his life. And I think, again, some of this language is a bit of a reflection of his own life and his own struggles to overcome his illnesses and the sort of psychological and physical torment that he felt throughout much of his life. And elsewhere in other texts, he couches this sort of notion in terms that Aaron was mentioning, more as a notion that what we need in life are obstacles, things that we need to struggle with and struggle against in order to keep ourselves dynamic and fresh and strong. And it's really obstacles and things that, once again, we need to struggle with and struggle against that sort of keep us young and keep us on our toes and keep us dynamic and creative, etc.
And says in one of the other texts, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. So is well known for that.
Famous Nietzschean quote.
Yes. Kisper.
Yeah, but I don't necessarily think he means we need to go seeking after suffering and things like that. That'll come anyway, but we need to rise above what does come and become better through those things that happen to us that cause suffering.
Very
and not
good.
necessarily seek after it.
Right.
No, he doesn't want you looking for it. No,
Although, once again, if you are leading what he considers to be an active and fulfilling and rich and dynamic life, as you pointed out, it's going to come. The pain is going to come with that. There are going to be points in your life where you're going to fall down and experience pain, suffering, physical, psychological, etc. So don't jump off a cliff, of course, but when you're out there living an exciting and rich and fulfilling and dynamic life, realize that unfortunately there are going to be times in your life when suffering is going to be a part of the equation.
That's true.
Absolutely. Yes, John.
Nietzsche also being really interested in the arts, there would really be no storytelling without some kind of suffering involved and people overcoming conflicts and suffering. And I think that's also really important to point out because Nietzsche was, he loved the arts and storytelling. So.
And even the storytelling through music.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Any points that you'd like to make, Rhonda?
Well, I'm just thinking that, he says that you must suffer. And I think about people that I know. Those who have suffered through experiences are the ones who have the most compassion, have the most understanding, have the most tolerance, the most understanding, all of those types of virtues that someone that has not yet in their life experienced really hard things, just says to you, pull your boots up and get on with it. There's no understanding there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Aaron?
But I think Nietzsche's going to have a problem with that, Rhonda.
Why is that, Aaron?
I don't want to give away the ending.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, but I think Nietzsche's going to say that compassion is a virtue is to fly into the face of some of what Nietzsche's saying here. He's saying that to treat, to think of these things that we in a Judeo-Christian tradition think of as virtues: compassion, humility, patience, long-suffering, meekness. All of these things that start to roll into this snowball together to Nietzsche are just not acceptable.
Oh, I agree
These
with
are
that.
just not okay.
Well, and I don't mean to make them sound like, they're all the little things that make a person perfect.
He's what I understood Rhonda to say actually was that no sympathy, no compassion.
Exactly.
Pull yourself up by the bootstraps and move along. So I think because you're absolutely right, Aaron. He's not going to go along with any of that.
Oh no.
No sympathy, no compassion.
Although understanding would be a positive characteristic from Nietzsche's view. And I think he might agree with the basic gist, I think, of what you're trying to get at, Rhonda, because certainly he has a great deal of difficulty with a practice that he associates with Judeo-Christianity and with religions in general, a practice of spending a lot of your time worrying about other people and how they live their lives and judging them and condemning them. And he thinks that this is ridiculous, this is not healthy for the person who's doing the judging and condemning, and it's a big waste of time, basically. And so if through your suffering you come to a position where you sort of understand
Yes.
that people are different and that it's silly and a waste of my time to worry about what they're doing and how they're living and judging them and condemning, if that's the sort of understanding that you arrive at, Nietzsche would
that's what I
certainly say
mean.
that that's a positive
That
thing.
without those hard experiences, you oftentimes can't go from A to B to C.
Okay, and Kisper, did you have your hand up as well?
I didn't. Aaron covered it.
Anything else on this? All right. Well, we'll get around to your end of the story. Let's go ahead and pull the next graphic up. And would you read this for us, Kisper?
I hope to be forgiven for discovering that all moral philosophy hitherto has been tedious and has belonged to the soporific appliances, and that virtue, in my opinion, has been more injured by the tediousness of its advocates than by anything else.
Wow, that's a fatal blow right there, Pierre. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that's just great. That's just Nietzsche. Once again, whether you agree or disagree with Nietzsche or buy a little bit of him but not other parts, you have to agree that he's probably the greatest writer in the history of the Western tradition. And at times he's just hilarious. You know?
I've just been more injured by your tediousness.
Your moral systems are all ridiculous. But worse than that, the people who are putting forward these moral philosophies, they're so boring. They're just
boring.
so dull and boring.
Okay, and so then he's going to move on in and talk about, well, then, is moralizing immoral? And would you read this for us, Erin?
Is not a moralist the opposite of a Puritan? That is to say, as a thinker who regards morality as questionable, as worthy of interrogation, in short, as a problem, is moralizing not immoral?
So is he getting into your territory here, John? Is moralizing immoral?
A little bit. I mean, he's saying that anyone who kind of puts forth a moral system or advocates a moral system in some way has got to see problems with the previous moral system. And if you see problems with the previous moral system, then you're questioning something that's not supposed to be questioned. And so moralizing itself is immoral.
Okay, so he's going to bring it that way. Do you have any other takes on it, Pierre?
That's basically it, I think, John, to consider the enterprise of morality and ethics to be something that is question-worthy is to question morality and ethics as they exist, which is not the way some moralists operate.
Sure, and as
the example that he offers, of course, is Puritans, who here's the law, obey.
And as we've seen in all of our class periods before now, each philosopher gives their brand of philosophy and says, this is how you do it, because I've got it down right here. And he's making fun of that too.
This is true. This is true.
So he's finding some fun here as he moves along. Well, let's pull up the next one. And Rhonda, would you read these for us?
In the end, they all want English morality to be recognized as authoritative, inasmuch as mankind, or the general utility, or the happiness of the greatest number. No, the happiness of England will be best served thereby.
And it continues.
Okay. They would like, by all means, to convince themselves that the striving after English happiness, I mean after comfort and fashion, and in the highest instance a seat in Parliament, is at the same time the true path of virtue.
Okay, and I'm going to have you read the very next one as well, too.
They are an unassuming and fundamentally mediocre species of men, these utilitarian Englishmen.
Yes, these utilitarian Englishmen.
Utilitarian.
So do you think he puts them right where they need to be on this, Erin?
He sure wants to. He sure wants to. No, I think he finds no use for this concept of the highest, the greatest good for the greatest number. He's going to go on to talk even more about how much this idea of pleasing the masses is just completely useless. It serves no purpose, and that these Englishmen who have put this forward have got it all wrong.
And he has to make fun of all of it.
Yes.
So he has to make fun of the dress and the Parliament and everything else, as well as
their high in haughtiness.
Their banal way of life. John?
I think it's really important to point out that Nietzsche is being funny here, and I think sometimes there's a tendency to take these kind of passages very literally, and it's like, no, Nietzsche is being kind of funny, and he's and a lot of Nietzsche is that way.
He's also, again, he's having some fun here, and in part by playing upon a cultural bias, actually, particularly in the philosophical world, whereby figures on the continent of Europe, Germany and France most prominently, look upon their brethren and sisters across the English Channel as sort of a silly race of people who are not deep thinkers. The English, and by extension we North American Anglos. The English, they're a very clever race. They're good with their hands. They're good at building stuff. You know, the Industrial Revolution took place there. So they're good at fixing things and building things, but as far as deep thought is concerned or great artistic expression, no, you have to go to the continent if you're going to find that.
That's right, that's right. They can go ahead and say they have happiness and the greatest happiness, but he says, no, it's not there. So he says then that life is essentially exploitation. So he's going to start off with a new thesis here, and let's see where we go with this, Kisper. Would you read that?
Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, conquest of the strange and weak, suppression, severity, obtrusion of peculiar forms, incorporation, and at the least, putting it mildest, exploitation.
Okay, he's laying it out. So this one now is not tongue-in-cheek. People might say, wow, that's pretty powerful. He must be kidding. But is he kidding with this, John?
Not really. And I like how he says it at the end. He says, putting it mildest, it's exploitation. I mean, exploitation is a kind of powerful word, and if we're going to call life at its essentials exploitation, it's a pretty powerful statement. And I think that he really wants people to recognize that life is not without suffering, that there is a lot of it, and that's what it is. And it's exploitation at its mildest.
And if you happen to be the strange and the weak and you're conquested, or you are subject to conquest, that's just the way it goes. Hey, that's the way it goes.
And of course, discourse like this in Nietzsche is beyond good and evil, to borrow a phrase from one of his most famous works. The passage that we read, Nietzsche would insist, is merely descriptive.
Right.
Descriptive of what life and what the development of human society has been all about. This is the way things are. I'm not prescribing this as the moral paradigm now. I'm not saying that because this is what life is about, therefore this is the new standard of what is good. I'm just describing the nature of things.
Okay. And if I were to complain to you, Pierre, about some boss that just did something really mean to me, and you were a Nietzschean, what would you tell me?
Well, you know, go set his car on fire, Elaine. Take care of business yourself. Take care of your own business. You don't have to put up with that.
Okay, so you were just the person who was conquested. Go do your own thing. Okay, if you play the game you want to play, then, all right. I don't think I could do anything to their car.
I don't know. You could booby trap their toothbrush or something. You'd find a way of exerting your own will to power in opposition to repression.
Yes. Okay. Well, Aaron, let's have you read the next one, because now we're going to move into the answer to Nietzsche. If you don't know the answer on the test, this is going to be the answer.
Exploitation does not belong to a depraved or imperfect or primitive society. It belongs to the nature of the living being as a primary organic function. It is a consequence of the intrinsic will to power, which is precisely the will to life.
Okay, so here he's going to start off with this notion of the will to power and the will to life. Why is this so important, Pierre?
Well, actually, just to make a point with regard to the graphic that we just read, it's clear that in passages like this, Nietzsche is showing the fact that he is very highly influenced by certain areas of developing science in the 19th century. Biological science, which is developing at a rapid state during this time period. And he's certainly influenced by figures such as Darwin. He's got a bit of a strained relationship with Darwin, but there's certainly aspects of Darwin's theory and of, again, the developing biological sciences that he's making reference to. And here it's on an individual level, simply a fact that an organism grows and develops by incorporating other organisms. This is a simple fact.
Okay. And
it, of course, is an expression of their own will to power, their own will to live their life and express their vital energy.
Perfect. So John, what would you like to add to this? Anything? Pierre says it so well, doesn't he?
He does say it very well, and it is important. The will to power is central to all Nietzschean philosophy, and in the end, it is going to be just this, that all life is this process of incorporating other organisms and overcoming certain struggles and almost having power over your own life and in some way power over others and the power to do what you want in this kind of self-affirming way.
Very good.
So.
Understanding where there's power, understanding that the will to power as a small organism or a big one is the will to life, the will to truly live your own life. Rather
And the
than
organism, of course, ultimately is a model for not just single-celled beings or individual human beings or individual animals. Nietzsche, of course, is saying, look at history itself. Look at the development of the organism that is human society. How has human society grown and developed? War, conquest, etc.
All right. Very good. Anyone want to add to this, Erin?
I think it's interesting that I think for Nietzsche that the will to power, to express that will, is not something we ever don't do. It's whether we have healthy expressions or unhealthy expressions, honest or dishonest, self-affirming, creative or not, but there's always this expression happening. I don't even know that you could say you have a choice. I mean, it's the choice is in how you choose to express it, not whether or not you have it. So.
Okay, Kisper, is it kind of a shocking thing to have a philosopher tell you that you must have this will to power, that it's the will to life? Have you ever been given permission before to have a will to power?
Well, not by some of the other philosophers. I mean, their philosophies, which Nietzsche has cut down, is saying we need to look at other people and the greatest good for the greatest number. He's saying, no, it's kind of about you. You need to have your own power over your own life and over the things surrounding you.
Okay, thanks. Were you going to say something, Pierre?
I think Nietzsche would also say that, look, once again, part of what I'm doing here is simply being descriptive and being honest about the way that this great and grand and wonderful thing that we call civilization has developed. I'm giving an honest assessment of what has gone on during the course of history. We North Americans, most people in this room, I believe, are from the United States of America. I'm from Canada. In both of our cultures, we celebrate the population, the European population of our nations, and the gradual role of the pioneers moving westward and all of this wonderful activities that took place during the time period of populating the Americas. And of course, we all know that the truth of that story is that it involved horrific violence and bloodshed towards other human beings.
Horrific struggle. And
Terrible, awful.
Truly the will to succeed, the will to power, the
Indeed.
will to life. It involved all of it. But does it seem kind of cynical to you, Rhonda?
Yes,
Okay.
but I think that's partly, his personality.
Okay.
And that we're able to, that honesty. Oftentimes, people use, tongue-in-cheek or some different measures in order to explain themselves. People listen better.
Okay.
This will to life is nothing more than survival of the fittest.
Okay. And that this group of people could come across the country without, other people saying, no, you can't do that, you can't have this way of worship, you can't have this way of life, you stay put, you go to jail, you do whatever. And instead they just say, hey, we're going to come somewhere else and we'll do what we want. We'll have our will to life. So it is a nice example that you give.
And again, once again, Nietzsche is not being prescriptive here. He's not
Nope.
saying that this is good, this is great that this happens, and he's not saying that it's bad. He's simply saying this is what life is.
Making it very organic. Once again, having a philosopher very interested in the sciences.
Definitely.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go ahead and pull up the next graphic. And would you read these for us, John?
Yeah. Moral philosophies, there are two types: master morality and slave morality.
And let's pull up the next graphic so that we can look at our master morality. And would you read that for us?
Yeah. Master morality. Noble and despicable equate good and evil. The noble man is exalted, proud. aristocratic, believe the common people to be untruthful, not the modern morality.
Okay, so John, do you want to tell us a little bit about master morality here?
Yeah, master morality is kind of that morality that just comes from a person asserting their will to power, and it's a very self-affirming process. They are what they are in the world, and they just identify the way they value things as good.
Okay. And we bring up these two notions here of good and evil. What's he saying about that, Aaron? He's saying noble and despicable equate good and evil?
I think he's beginning to really define for us in here the difference between bad and evil, and the different good that he's using. He's saying that for master morality, what is noble is the good, and what is despicable is the bad. And he's saying that it's not a matter of what is out there that is not like me that I'm most concerned with. What I'm most concerned with, what is noble, what is the thing that I want to be exalted, aristocratic, and these kinds of notions, and that is the good.
So suddenly we see the power in being able to make definitions on words. And he's saying some other people have hijacked these words because he said, and they've given them the wrong meanings, in fact. And he says, let's see how master morality is absolutely good, and the way that you should be living your life. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that, Pierre?
Well, I think one of the things that he's suggesting in this distinction between master and noble morality, and starting things off with his description of noble morality, master morality, master and slave rather, master, noble versus slave, is the notion that, look, really, once upon a time, and really it's still true today, moralities and moral systems and ethical systems were nothing other than ways of valuing things, ways of identifying things in your life and in your world that were valuable to you, that you liked, that were meaningful to you, were significant to you, that brought value and pleasure and joy into your life. And in noble master morality, these, what we now refer to as good values, were simply what reflected the great life that the noble classes were leading, right? Whatever reflected their lives, that's what was good. Whatever did not reflect their lives, whatever they found to be insignificant, despicable, superfluous, became bad.
John.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, we're talking about how master morality identifies things as good and bad, and later we're going to talk about how slave morality identifies them as good and evil. And I think that last graphic's just a little bit confusing because it says noble and despicable equate good and evil. But really, when master morality, when they're looking out at the world, they identify things as good or bad. And bad's not what's like them or like their way of life.
Never would be, because they get to define it.
Yeah, exactly.
And he's going to say that's who you want to be, in fact. Rhonda, could I get you to read the next graphic for us, please?
The noble type of man regards himself as a determiner of values. He does not require to be approved of. He passes the judgment. What is injurious to me is injurious in itself. He knows that it is he himself only who confers honor on things. He is a creator of values. He honors whatever he recognizes in himself. Such morality is self-glorification.
And continue on.
The noble man also helps the unfortunate, but not or scarcely out of pity, but rather from an impulse generated by the superabundance of power. Okay,
thanks. So we've got this superabundance of power. We've got a noble man who is a determiner of values. He doesn't have to have the approval of anyone. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this kind of person, Aaron or Kisper?
Yes, this kind of person is someone who can decide for themselves what they do with their own life. And like it says here, that they may help the unfortunate, but it's not because they pity them or because they want to help them to be a good person. It's because they have so much that they're like, sure, take it.
Very good. What is this superabundance of power, Pierre?
Well, again, it's a reflection of the sort of physiological state of somebody who has lived an active and dynamic life and sought out obstacles in order to make themselves stronger, and is just vigorous and, you know, the old ordinary everyday language expression, full of life.
Okay.
And again, it's the sort of person who somebody falls down, they're not going to sympathize with them or say, oh, how terrible this thing happened to you, or they're not going to think about a reward that they might get for doing a virtuous act. They don't care about that. Somebody falls down, they pick them up because they can, because they have the strength to do that, because they're full of life and full of vigor.
And have this power. They understand their own power and have a superabundance of it. So know how to make it grow.
It's a great word, superabundance.
Yeah, they know how to make their own power grow. And so much of it comes back to this, is he says, what is injurious to me is injurious in itself. I'm going to define what's injurious. You know, and did you want to comment on that, Rhonda?
No, I agree with everything that's being said. I'm just agreeing with you. I'm right with you.
Oh, okay, all right. And he recognizes, he honors whatever he recognizes in himself. That's what he's going to honor. So he really hands himself the power then. Okay, anyone want to add anything to this noble man? So why does Nietzsche esteem the aristocrat so much, or the noble man?
Well, again, Nietzsche, I don't really want to use the term ideal here, but certainly a reflection of Nietzsche's conception of what it would mean to live a truly good life in some robust sense, in some real sense, is to once again be in a position from which you are able to express yourself. And you are not dependent upon others and beholden to others. Rather, you are capable of being independent and creative and once again simply able to express whatever it is that makes you the human being that you are.
Well, the
whether
aristocrat
it's
is never
tremendous
wrong.
aesthetic or artistic creativity or whatever else it might be.
Okay. Yeah. The aristocrat is never wrong. You're the head of your own estate. You can do what you wish.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. And now we move to the very pitiable group, or slave morality. And Erin, would you read these definitions for us?
Of course. Slave morality, in which the slave fears the powerful, skepticism and distrust of happiness, the morality of modern ideas, essentially the morality of utility. Within this morality lies the origin of the antithesis good and evil.
Okay, and the next one as well.
It is here that sympathy, the kind, helping hand, the warm heart, patience, diligence, humility, and friendliness attain to honor. For here these are the most useful qualities, and almost the only means of supporting the burden of existence.
Okay, I just hand it right back to you then, Erin.
Go
Go ahead and tell us. You said that you jumped to the end of the story, but tell us more about this, the slave morality.
I think what Nietzsche's setting up here is the difference between obviously the slave and the master moralities. And he's saying that in the slave morality, where the creator of values is outside of you, and we maintain the creator of values is outside of you, being the aristocrat or the master, and you are in the slave position, what is most valuable for you to maintain status quo as a slave? Humility, patience, diligence, friendliness, because you're not rocking any boats that way. And so those are useful. And help you accomplish your main goal, which is just to survive. And I think that it's important that he thinks that that is still the current morality.
So John, did you want to, thank you, very well done. John, did you want to be known as a slave?
Well, not really. I'd definitely rather be identified as kind of a person that's able to express himself in a Nietzschean way in a lot of ways. But
He uses a very powerful word here when he uses slave, doesn't he? I mean,
He
nobody
does.
wants to be classified as the slave. And then the description of it too. How does it start ringing true and make you say, I don't want to be this? How does he do that, Pierre?
Once again, I think probably the most important aspect of the distinction, I think, is the notion that, again, Nietzsche is not being prescriptive in his distinction between these two value systems, these two different ways of finding meaning and significance and things of importance in one's life. Mm-hmm. He believes that one is originary, more original than the other. The noble value system is more original because, on his view, if you just examine history, in any culture, the first moral systems in the sense of categories of things that were good, categories of things that were meaningful and significant and important were simply drawn up by the people who were in positions of power.
Right.
And in almost any culture, including the one that we live in today, there are people at the top and there are people at the bottom. And in more archaic cultures, the people on the bottom were generally literally slaves. And the originary moral system in these cultures was originated by the people in power, and it was just whatever reflects my life, this is what is good. It's natural for people, all people, to seek things out in their lives that are valuable and useful to them and meaningful for them. And so the people who are on the bottom, the slaves in any culture, are also going to have a way of valuing things. And it's going to be natural for them to think, we're living pretty crummy lives. Who's responsible for this? Those people. Mm-hmm. So their originary mode of valuing is to point at everything associated with the nobles, the aristocrats, and call that not bad, but ultimately
Evil.
Evil.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that doesn't reflect that, anything that reflects my sort of miserable, horrible, humble, necessarily humble life, this is what is good. And so this is sort of, I think, the essence of the distinction between these two. And again, it's very important to remind ourselves, once again, that Nietzsche believes this is simply a description of the way people, cultures, value things in their own life and things in the world in general.
Thank you. And somebody's going to be making the rules. And if you're not the one making the rules, then it's going to be someone else. And they also may be the enforcer of the rules. And you might not like any of that. And, but yet maybe put up with it for a variety of reasons that he might say are illusory.
But it's also, in his view, natural and normal for people who are in positions of being on the bottom of any social strata, being slaves literally, or simply being at the bottom of the barrel. It's completely natural and normal for people who are in that position and leading kind of crummy lives where they're oppressed to develop this way of looking at the world. And really that's what a morality as a value system is. It's a way of looking at the world and what's meaningful and what's important out there. And it's just, of course, if you're a slave, you're going to think this way.
Sure, sure. Becomes evil and harmful. Yes, Erin.
I think this is the part where Nietzsche at one point says this is where human beings become interesting, is when this happens. So it's funny. I mean, he's having some fun with it, and I think that he himself recognizes that this is natural and an important move, and this is I think the transvaluation that he's talking about, this move where the good is something different and the evil is something different. And I don't think he's calling us to go back to master morality. Certainly not, because I think the thing that we read from the nobleman that's so critical is that creator aspect. Again, and so it's not, we should go back to other systems of morality. We shouldn't go backwards. Going backwards is not really ever an option. He says go forwards and create something new for yourself. And I find that part uplifting rather than pessimistic or even nihilistic, as Nietzsche gets accused, which I think he would be mortified.
And of course, and he says explicitly in some of the readings from our text that the most interesting and the most highly developed both individuals and cultures are ones in which you have a mixture of these two ways of valuing things that are sort of struggling and trying to reconcile with each other. Noble morality is noble, but it reflects kind of a naive and childish worldview. Slave morality, unhealthy, but the slaves, boy oh boy, they were clever. They were clever. And ultimately, they got the upper hand. And human beings, human society, became interesting when this sort of way of looking at the world, this sort of crazy, on Nietzsche's view, perverse way of looking at the world, perverse but very, very interesting, very, very fascinating, and ultimately very creative way of looking at the world first began to develop.
This is a wonderful discussion. I'm really enjoying this. John, let's have you go ahead and read the next graphic for us.
Slave morality versus master morality. A last and fundamental difference. The desire for freedom, the instinct for happiness, and the refinements of the feeling of liberty belong as necessarily to slave morals and morality as artifice and enthusiasm in reverence and devotion are the regular symptoms of an aristocratic mode of thinking and estimating.
Okay, John, put that in your own words for us.
That's a tough one, but I mean, he's going to say that there are certain characteristics that we might associate with slave morality and master morality that can also be found in the other. And maybe someone else should elaborate on that a little bit, but that's essentially what I'm understanding from this.
Okay.
So.
He's also developing the point that Nietzsche believes that a revolution in values has taken place. The more originary way of valuing things, the noble or aristocratic or master value system morality, has to a great extent been overturned, and the dominant moral system, the dominant worldview way of valuing things within Western culture has become slave morality. Which is not to say that the two aren't interspersed and there aren't elements of both within culture, and through the development of Western history, sometimes more aristocratic values get the upper hand. But by and large, for the most part, Western culture and Western morality is basically characterized by the slave mentality and the slave value systems. And so he points out some of the values that we all think are very significant and important: freedom, happiness, liberty, these values that, again, we identify as positive. He's pointing out these are actually slave values. These are reflections of a slave mentality, which just reinforces my point that slave mentality and slave values have overcome this more originary, more noble, more aristocratic way of looking at things.
Okay, thanks.
Question, where
Kisper.
did Nietzsche put himself? Did he put himself in the category of master morality or slave morality?
That's a good question. I think he considered himself to be a visionary and an extraordinarily original and creative thinker. And he was right about that, by the way. I think he recognized himself as one of the most originary, again, and creative thinkers of the century. And so I think he places himself as sort of in the category of having a more aristocratic or noble outlook on the world.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's look at the next two slides then, and can you read these for us, Erin?
For one thing is needful, that a human being attain his satisfaction with himself, whether it be by this or by that poetry and art. Only then is a human being at all tolerable to behold. And the next?
And the next one?
Whoever is dissatisfied with himself is always ready to revenge himself therefore. We others will be his victims, if only by always having to stand his ugly sight. For the sight of the ugly makes men bad and gloomy.
Okay, Erin, tell us a little bit about that.
This may be where I would bring up that I find Nietzsche very violent. And I think that part of this violence is maybe a product of his misogynistic tendencies, but at the same time, I think what he's saying, it can be taken for all human beings. If we take it out of the very violent connotations that he has, and we take away maybe the the gender-specific language and these other things, that we would see that what he is in favor of is this creative process, and that when we are in the presence of others who are not creative, it makes us less creative as well. I think he's pointing something out there that's interesting to
Okay,
me.
so absolutely is going to privilege that you do push forward your arts. If you have these talents in music, in literature, in painting, whatever it might be, he would absolutely privilege these. But he's also going to say, we others will be his victims, if only by having to stand his ugly sight. So someone who's always willing to, is dissatisfied with themselves, nothing is ever good enough, then we're always going to be the victim to this.
Dangerous.
Yeah, to this person's complaint.
Yeah, these aesthetic categories too are also largely sort of metaphorical. One of the things that Nietzsche is suggesting here is that you can live your life in two ways, basically. You can live a beautiful life, a rich, fulfilling, dynamic, active, wonderful life, or you can live an ugly life. You can live a life that is timid and mediocre and mean, literally mean. And this is the choice that you have before you. Live your life as though it's a work of art, a great work of fiction, or live your life as a drone, which is an ugly life.
You know, I think one of the things that I hear that goes through here is, you know, do you choose to live your life in abundance, or do you choose to live your life in scarcity?
Okay, and I think that's a great concluding
It's a very
question
good way of putting it.
For the class, yes. And I've really appreciated having you on the class with us today,
It's been a
Pierre.
pleasure, Elaine.
Your insights are just outstanding, and I wish we could go on for another hour.
Me too.
And I've really enjoyed you students too. You've just done such a grand job in interpreting the quotes and telling us your views on it and asserting your own power on these too. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.